Well, everybody, I'm proud to introduce a friend of mine, and I'm honored to call him a friend, Mr. Jack Sacco. And we were introduced through a mutual friend, Matthew Marsden. Fantastic gentleman. And man, Jack, I've learned so much from you, and I appreciate you taking the time to
Thank you.
sit down and have this chat with me. I've learned so much from you, and it's been an honor. And I feel very strongly that the rest of the world deserves to learn what I have from you. And so I'm excited to have
Thank you.
this chat. I think this could be
My
globe
pleasure.
changing because, I mean, there's no greater name known throughout human history than Jesus Christ. I mean, that's the most known
Right.
name ever. And so the resurrection is what it all hinges on. And I think the subject matter we're going to discuss is of global significance, certainly biblical significance, literally. So I just want to kind of break the ice by introducing how you came to be intimately knowledgeable on the Shroud of Turin, how that came about, and why we're listening to your experience and expertise on it. And I'll chat with you with my observations and questions. And when I'm wrong, because I'm just a layman, I think this is ridiculous, quite honestly, that I'm getting to sit down with you and have this chat. So
It's my pleasure.
yeah, but we'll go through it, and man, feel free to share anything that you think is important, or correct me if I misrepresent anything out of layman's ignorance. And I'm just glad to be here. So
Thank you. I got started interested in the Shroud of Turin. I had to put it this way, I had no interest in it at all. I have an engineering degree from the University of Notre Dame. And so I, knew the technical studies, and my degree is in mechanical and aerospace engineering. So I guess I'm technically trained as a rocket scientist. But when it came, I was told about the Shroud. I had heard about it, and I heard that it was fake and all this, and I assumed that it must have to be. And actually, it was my mother who came to me and said, why don't you do some studies on some research on the Shroud of Turin? To which I replied to her, well, it's got to be a fake. And she said, well, how do you know it's a fake? I said, well, I saw in the newspaper that they did a carbon dating and that it was a fake. And so that's it. And she said, well, do you consider that really good research, to research like something in the newspaper? I said, no, actually not. She said, well, what other evidence do you have? Any positive or negative? What do you have? And I said, I really don't have anything. And so I just got interested in it that way. And I thought, well, it shouldn't be difficult to prove that this is a fake. And so I started talking to people. I started reading. I actually not only ended up interviewing a lot of the scientists and researchers, engineers, physicists, et cetera, who had actually studied the Shroud itself, but I actually had the opportunity to go over to Turin and visit the Shroud. And after 20 or so years of doing that, and I did it a lot, every question that was answered brought more questions. And the one thing that I could tell early on was it wasn't a fake, it wasn't a painting, and it wasn't a trick, but it definitely was not a fake in all the ways that you hear. And so I became more and more interested, not only of the cloth itself, the history of the cloth, which was incredibly fascinating, but also the physics of the cloth and the physics of this image that's on the cloth. So that's the genesis, if you will, of my interest in the Shroud, and it went from there to actually being able to visit the cloth and find out all these incredible things about it, that were many of which were contrary to the sort of myths you hear about it reported in the news. A lot of the facts that they said were true were not even true. It had no resemblance to what the actual evidence was.
well, there's a lot of people that would certainly want to keep it quiet because it steps on some toes about people that believe other things. And so,
right.
There may be a concerted effort to keep the information silent, which is one of my motivations to just shine the light on it. And that's why I appreciate this study that was done so scientifically without bias, just to determine
my only bias
happened
at the beginning was to prove that it was a fake. that was where I was coming from. And I thought it should be pretty easy because, the evidence will be there. We can tell things, it's not magic. We can tell what something is or is not. Once again, not based on media, not based on anything other than what's actually there or not there. So,
well, I guess we owe your mom a bit of thanks for pushing you to read past the headlines and actually investigate. If only more people would do that these days.
She did indeed, yeah.
We need more of your mama.
I think that's truth. That's the true statement right there.
Yeah,
we need
sounds
more
like
people
she's
like her.
pushed you to dig for facts, which is so critical. Well, great. Well, when I was, you and I have had some long telephone conversations,
right.
and I just was so fascinated learning from you what you had discovered, and I wrote down some notes on what I understood your discussion with me to mean. And so if I rattle off any of these things that I took from it that are not accurate, please correct me and so that everybody else hears your correction as well, because I don't want to get any of this wrong. I don't have any motivation other than for people to understand scientifically what you do. So great stuff. Well, there's so many things about it. I think the carbon dating is a good place to start, though. So that I think that's a lot of what people know about it most recently that haven't dug further behind the headlines. They're like, carbon dating says it's debunked us, so they moved on.
Right.
But the carbon dating was botched. It was not done accurately. There was a problem with that. Would you like to just quickly set the stage with that so everybody understands what took place there?
Yeah, indeed. One of the things that I thought, I have an engineering degree, but one of the things that I erroneously thought up until the point of studying this and researching it was that carbon dating was absolute, that it was sort of like a DNA test, that it would tell you an exacting answer. And one of the first things I learned when I started doing this is I started speaking to people from many, many different fields, like I say, including physicists, engineers, archaeologists, textile experts, et cetera. And what I was surprised that archaeologists were telling me that they don't trust carbon dating as much as you would think. We tend to look at carbon dating as, like I say, some type of exact science, and it's not. And it especially wasn't in the 1980s when the carbon dating on the Shroud was done. And in fact, there have been several methods of carbon dating through the years. With this particular method that was done on the Shroud, the man who the doctor who had discovered this or invented this method of carbon dating had warned that this method will not work on the Shroud. Carbon dating is based, and without getting into too much of the complexities of it, which I'm happy to do, but we don't have time here. And that's one of the problems in discussing all these things. I'm taking I generally take hours and hours and years worth of research and try to condense it down into a few minutes. But I have all the research, and that's one of the things I'm very a stickler about, is getting all the details and getting all the research done. But one of the carbon dating is based on assumptions. It's based on some basic assumptions, and one of the assumptions is there's a certain amount of carbon-14. There's carbon-13, carbon-12, carbon-14, carbon-50. There's different types of carbon. Carbon-14 is radioactive, so it decays over time. So there are certain assumptions to look at how much is decayed and to assume how much was originally in a leaf or a bone or something like that, something living, and you assume how much was originally in there, how much is going to decay over time, and then you could tell about how old that piece of material is. And one of the assumptions is that this piece of material is pristine. It hasn't been burnt, it hasn't been exposed to the elements, it hasn't had any carbon added to it. So if you add carbon to something, it throws off the time because it makes it look like it's a lot younger than it really is, because that carbon-14 should have decayed. Now there's more there that you added by coughing on it or burning it or any number of ways. And And then we found out later on that, even after the 1980s, that carbon doesn't decay at the rates that we thought it did. And also the carbon is not stable inside of our initial assumption is that there may be a certain amount of carbon-14 in let's say a leaf that we find frozen in a glacier. Well, that there might not be that much carbon in that leaf, depending on the weather, depending on volcanic activity, depending on all these other things. So all I'm saying is that some of the basic assumptions to carbon dating are not even accurate to begin with. And so having done, and carbon dating is generally done, archaeologists were telling me that carbon dating was done to sort of back up what they already knew and verify what they already knew, as opposed to point them at a certain point in time and saying this came from the Middle Ages, or this came from 10,000 years ago. There were, for example, there were a lot of mistakes done with carbon dating in the type of carbon dating that was done on the Shroud. Like I say, it was a new type. The inventor of it had said it won't work on the Shroud because, for several reasons. One is that shrouds and cloths are not found in nature. In other words, they don't grow on a tree. They're not running around on their own. They're created by man. And the creation of a cloth adds carbon to it. It's going to make it look younger. Sometimes things like even water sometimes can date into the you can carbon date water, believe it or not,
Oh, wow.
because there are things, there's pollutants in water, like in streams, etc. But sometimes items can actually date to the future because there's so much there's more carbon there than was assumed that would be there, at the beginning of their existence. But just to run down a couple of things, just to show you how this works. When the cloth was made, there was starch put on it. There was all these materials added to it. There was pollen on the cloth. All of these were adding carbon to it. Interestingly enough, using this same method of carbon dating that they used on the Shroud in the mid-1980s, they took one thread of the Shroud, one thread. At one end, they carbon dated it to come from the year 200 AD. The other end of the same thread carbon dated to be from the year 1000 AD. So unless it took someone 800 years to weave that thread, then that carbon dating was off. But it had to do with starches and molds and fungus and all this other. In 1983, Zurich, they did and this is one of the labs that did the carbon dating on the Shroud. They dated Peruvian cotton and it dated to be 1,000 years younger than its known age. University of Arizona, another university near you that was involved in the carbon dating of the Shroud, dated an ancient Viking horn. So they knew it was an ancient Viking horn. They dated it to be from the year 2006. That was in 1988. Wow. So it was coming up from it was from the future. And Egyptian mummy badges were dated to be 1,000 years younger than they were known to be. Leaves from a tree in Rome, a 1-year-old tree dated to be 400 years old. 30,000-year-old mammoth fur dated to be 5,000 years old. A seal that had just died, they carbon dated, and it dated to be 1,300 years old. They dated 38 different objects. Only 7 came back with the correct answer. And so this was the same. So after that, people who had done the Shroud carbon dating had said, well, it was wrong. I mean, that method of carbon dating something did not work for that well, and definitely didn't work on something with the prominence of the Shroud, which it's gone through history. It's been burned. It's been set on fire. It's been exposed to the elements for years and years and years. And so it was a more actual. And in fact, one of the discoveries was that, and I examined this up close myself, personal, is that the area where they took the piece where they dated the Shroud is actually part of a patch that was put on in 1534 by some nuns. The Shroud was in a fire in 1532. The nuns put on some patches in 1534 so the whole thing wouldn't fall apart. And they're pretty sure that what they actually dated was from a patch put on in 1534. So the shroud itself, so what I learned from that, and this is a long-winded answer, but I learned from that that the carbon dating that I had assumed, and like many had assumed, was, you know, strict high-end scientific evidence, like a DNA, is not scientific evidence. Oh, it's not even admissible in a court of law.
Oh.
It's not
So
even
this,
accurate enough to be admissible in a court of law. So it's a great thing for media to run about and people to say this is fake or this is real, but it really doesn't mean much in the you know, as evidence of anything, especially as scientific evidence, and
wow.
especially for the shroud. So I was able to discount that completely. And believe me, I went through a year or two of study of carbon dating all types of things. I'm just giving you the high end, the highlights.
Yeah, just a glimpse. I mean, I find myself just as a citizen wishing people would be more unbiased and honest, rather than trying to spin things the way that they want it to be, like taking the carbon dating that was erroneous and just deciding, well, that's the end all be all. We're going to say that it's debunked and bury it forever. And I find myself really disappointed and seeing that there's that effort, you know, on whoever does that kind of thing. If only people are just more honest and unbiased and go, okay, whatever it is, let's learn what it is, good, bad, or indifferent. Let's see what's going on and represent it that way. I think we'd be better off. But, you know, I'm a little bit of an idealist, I guess.
No, but that's the way it should be. And people love to jump to conclusions. I did it myself. They jumped to the conclusion it can't be real, it's a fake. I heard about a carbon dating, I read something about it in some newspaper somewhere. Well, you know, I was the one making the mistake by assuming that, because when I went and looked at it, looked at the evidence, and these people, different scientists and physicists, et cetera, around the world that I visited, showed me their data. They, you know, they didn't show me a newspaper. They showed me, here's our scientific data, here's our papers, here's the evidence that we had. And you would, as an engineer, I was able to interpret that myself. But you know, Abraham Lincoln once, you know, he went to a group and he asked them, he was speaking, he said, if we call a dog's tail a leg, how many legs does it have? And the crowd said, well, 5. And he said, no, the correct answer is 4. Just because you call a tail a leg doesn't make it 1. You know, so it's the same thing here. You could call something, that doesn't make it what it really is. You know, there were still only 4 legs on that dog, and the same thing with this, the carbon dating. In fact, if anything, people thought the carbon dating was going to expose the shroud as being a fake, and that's what they wanted it to be, and so that's what they trumpeted through the newspapers. In fact, the shroud, in many ways, exposed carbon dating for being inaccurate, and especially that form of carbon dating, which is not even used anymore. Now we use other things, thermoluminescence, et cetera, other methods to date things, but that particular method of carbon dating is not even used. And one of the ways that we know that it doesn't work was we looked at the shroud and we said that can't possibly be the right answer. And then all these discoveries were made. And when the retractions were actually made, when the retractions were made by the carbon daters who did it, you know, and they said, well, we got it wrong, and this dates all the way back to the 1st century, none of that was trumpeted through the media. So there's an agenda there, whatever it is, maybe just, you know, they decide whatever news sells, but you know, it's unfortunate. Like I say, I rather look at the facts, and if it dates a certain time, it dates a certain time, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. And so, in the case of the shroud, you know, people like the idea that it dated from the Middle Ages, and it was probably done by an artist, but that's not true. That's not actually what happened. And none of the evidence pointed toward that. In fact, I'll just say this. I'll give you the bottom line right at the beginning, sort of close to the beginning of this conversation, is in my 20 or 30 years now, I guess, or so, of studying the shroud and, you know, all of the science of it. And I study it from a scientific point of view, not a theological point of view. I'm not a theologian. That's not my area of expertise or, you know, interest. My interest is in the science and in the history. And in studying that way, I've never found, despite what people will say, although inaccurately, I've never found, and I've studied the evidence and the shroud itself, I've never found any evidence to indicate that it's fake. Nothing indicates that it's fake. Nothing.
Well, then, Jack, let's delve into what we do know, or what you were
Yeah,
able to ascertain.
that's
And
the interesting part.
am I inaccurate in my understanding that the way that the shroud was looked at was really as like a witness to a crime scene, forensically? What took place here with this artifact? What can we make from it, and just build the data and then start to build a picture from there? Is that accurate to say? Or
Yeah. What I did is, and what happened with the study of the shroud, and the study of the shroud goes all the way back. It began actually in 1898, and there was a man who took a photograph of it. It was the first photograph taken of the shroud, and his name was Segundo Pia, and he was a lawyer and a part-time, like an amateur photographer. He took this photograph of the shroud, and he was amazed that the photograph of the shroud was a photographic positive. The negative was a positive, and so he looked at this his photographic negative and realized it was a positive image. It was a like this incredibly 3D image of a man, and nobody had ever seen anything like that before. With the whites and blacks and darks and lights reversed. And from that time on, it started getting a lot of scientific scrutiny. In the early 1900s, interestingly, there was a man named Yves Delage in France, who was a member of the French Academy, and very well respected. He considered himself an agnostic, but he started studying the shroud. He started looking at the image as a pathologist would look at the image, and what was this? Looked like a human body, but what were the dimensions, and what had happened to this body? And there was a doctor named Pierre Barbet who did the same thing around the same time. Interestingly, Yves Delage, the Frenchman, decided he came to the conclusion after several years of studying it that this was the historical Jesus of Nazareth. And he found it hard to believe himself, but he said, I'm sure that this had to be the historic Jesus of Nazareth. And he was expelled from the French Academy for saying that. And he made a very interesting statement, which I thought. He said, he didn't use these words, but he basically said, I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm an agnostic. I don't care. I'm not promoting anybody's religion. He said, but he said, I don't understand why people get so emotional over the idea that this might be the historical Jesus of Nazareth, who may be one of the, if not the most famous person who ever lived. I don't understand why people get so upset that this may be a remnant of, of Jesus of Nazareth. He said, here was a man who, by all historical accounts, never really did anything wrong. He never hurt anybody.
Right.
All he did was help people. And he's like the only good person we've ever had through history, And he said, why are people, he said, if this had been a king or a pharaoh or some, dignitary through history, we had a record of his life or a document of his life, or, he said, nobody would be upset, but because it's him, people get very emotional. I've always really thought that was an interesting comment, that, this was, and once again, this was back in around 1903. And he said, I don't understand why you people are so emotional and have all these, get so angry about the fact that Jesus lived. We know he lived, and yet here's something that tells us that he was on earth. And, what it means, that's up to you to decide. But the fact that it's here, it is just a fact.
Yeah, humans' response to things like that are interesting. For sure. Well, the shroud itself, Jack, was a heavy linen, an expensive linen.
Right.
Can you just first talk about the garment itself? What you know about just the fabric, and who made it? Because I understand that they can even determine the right or left-handedness of the person who wove it. And it's just some things like that, may not make any difference on people's belief, but it's factual evidence that you guys were able to ascertain from studying the thing. So
right, it's amazing the level of detail about what happened to with the cloth itself, and then what happened near the cloth, even what happened in proximity to it. But it's a cloth that's 14 feet long, about four. It's actually the exact dimension here. I'll read it off: 14 feet 3 inches by 3 feet 7 inches, which is a very strange, and that's big. I mean, it's sometimes when I give lectures about it, I'll bring out a replica, and it's very, very big. 14 feet by 3.5 feet. You know, that's a big cloth, and in the metric system is 4.34 by 1.1 meters. Now those are, you know, 14.143 and 3 feet 7 and 4.34. Those are all odd
numbers. Yeah.
Very odd numbers. Like, why would they cut it exactly that? Well, it turns out that, in ancient Jerusalem, somebody wouldn't measure in feet or inches or meters. They would measure in cubits. And it turns out that the cloth is exactly 8 cubits by 2 cubits. Exactly. And that's how big the cloth is. Also, it's pure linen. In ancient Jerusalem, in order for a cloth to be used as a burial cloth, it would have to be what we call legal. And so it would have to be, pure linen. It would not be wool. It could not even be made on loom that was used to loom wool. It would, you could use the same. Interestingly, you could use that loom to manufacture linen or cotton, but not wool ever. Wool was off on its own set of apparatus, on its own apparatus. You would never find a mixture of wool and linen together. Interestingly, this cloth is 8 cubits by 2 cubits. It's pure linen with microscopic traces of cotton. And the cotton is, interestingly, cotton is not grown in Europe, and cotton is, and wasn't then. And cotton, this type of cotton is called Gossypium herbaceum, which is known to be grown in and around Egypt. And so that means that probably cotton, it's that type of cotton from the Middle East was woven on this particular loom. Also, the technology of the loom was. Technology changes through the years, and this was typical of a very well made, heavy, thick cloth, but it's a very rough cloth because it was made in the 1st century. We can tell even 100 or 200 years later, the technology was different. It's also what's known as a 3-to-1 herringbone twill, 3 loops over to 1 loop under, and this would be a very fine, a very expensive cloth. And it's also, you were talking about the nature of how it was woven. It's woven with a very distinctive, what's called a Z twist, which would be the opposite of what's more common, is called the S twist, which basically means this was woven by a left-handed person. So we can tell that. And then we can also tell there's pollen on the cloth, and there's a lot of pollen on the cloth, on the top of the cloth, because pollen just gets on everything. But there's 3 times as much pollen in the cloth, in the weave of the cloth itself. And in the weave, I mean attached to the threads before they were woven by this left-handed person. So those pollens were attached before the cloth was even woven together. The other pollens were attached afterwards. The cloth, the pollens that are attached to the threads themselves before they were woven and are integral to the cloth itself are from Jerusalem. They're from Jerusalem, and they're from plants that bloom in the springtime, and some of which have been extinct for almost 2,000 years.
Wow. So there's pollen within the fibers themselves that mark the time and the location.
And the location that it was woven.
Shortly thereafter.
Right. So these couldn't have been added afterwards. Somebody would have taken the cloth apart, attached the pollens from plants that were extinct and other plants that are only grown in Jerusalem and around Jerusalem in the springtime, attach those pollens to the fibers, and then woven it back together using 1st century techniques
at a microscopic level.
At a microscopic level, you can't see this stuff.
Right.
And then there's also pollen on the surface from Edessa, which is modern day Sanli Urfa in Turkey, where we know that the shroud was for a few hundred years. And then we know it was moved to Constantinople, which is modern day Istanbul. And there's pollen there from Constantinople. There's also pollen from France and Italy, because it's been in France and Italy for the last 600 years. So all of that cloth, all of that pollen is on the top of the cloth.
Yeah.
And the pollen inside the weave of the cloth is all from Jerusalem.
Let me ask you this real quick. I don't want to belabor this, but because we got a lot to cover, but
yeah,
is the pollen from the different locations that the shroud went, Jack, is it sequential in its layering, one upon the top of the other, so you can see the most recent from the...
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Like I say, the easiest is those that were woven into the cloth itself, right, which were the ones that when the flax was being made into to linen threads, that pollen was attached then, and then those threads were woven together. Interestingly enough, on top of the cloth, once the cloth was woven together, one of the first layers there of any foreign substance was something called there's calcium on the cloth, and it's from a rare form of limestone called aragonite. And this calcium is still on the cloth. And that form of calcium, that form of aragonite limestone is very, very rare in the world, but it's on the cloth. So it got on the cloth somehow. There's only a few aragonite limestone quarries in the world. And so what they were able to do is take some of that aragonite calcium and take it to the Enrico Fermi Laboratory near Chicago and study it under what's known as an electron microprobe and see if there's a match, because you could tell that would be like a DNA match. You could tell, where did this limestone come from? Where did this aragonite calcium come from? And so they got samples from different limestone quarries around the world with the aragonite limestone, and they sought to find a match. Was there a match for the limestone that's on the shroud? And they did find one match, and one match only. And that match was from a place called the Tomb of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. So we know that the shroud itself, that cloth, was in that tomb. Because I've been in that tomb, and that limestone it's like chalk. It will fall on, it will rub off on you. You can't get it off either. You're just rubbing it in more if you try to get it off. But that limestone has been on there for 2,000 years, and it came out of that cave. Okay.
Wow.
That one, not any others. So you put all this together, and you start having a preponderance of evidence that says this cloth was woven there. It was woven, but with materials that were there from threads that were there, and it was in that tomb.
Yeah, that location at that time. And
that location, no other location. That location.
It's fascinating to me too. As time goes on, and our technology increases, we can go back and right, study with greater technology. And every time somebody says that they debunk anything that I've got a lot of friends that are not a lot of friends, but I've got some friends that are archaeologists that have done a lot of digs over in Jerusalem and around there, and they describe all kinds of things that they dig up that prove exactly what they know or what they read in the Bible. But it seems like those stories don't really get out so much in the mainstream these days. But it's interesting to see people go back and study and go, oh no, it was true after all. And the people debunk it for a while, but it only lasts for a season. And it inevitably seems like science comes back and goes, no, it was accurate after all. So
yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. And there's always somebody looking for attention who will make a claim based on either no evidence at all or a tiny bit of evidence. But but in order to make that claim, they have to ignore the massive part of the evidence and just talk about one little aspect. It's misleading. It's not. There's a lot of bad science running around these days, in a lot of facets of our lives. As an engineer, that's one of the things I've I've always taken notice of. And one of the reasons I actually started studying this in the first place is I was, I heard things, as I explained before, and then I said, well, but how does that square off with the actual evidence? What's true or what's not true? And we should never be afraid of where the evidence will lead us, because what's true or not true is just true or not true. We shouldn't be afraid of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I was trained as a federal criminal investigator. Crime scene investigation, you follow the evidence,
get the bad guy,
and the totality of the circumstances, wherever it leads, whether that be good, bad, or indifferent. If you go in there with an open mind and you consume all of the available information, and
you'll find the truth.
You'll discover what took place there, or a lot better information than people who had some sort of preconceived idea.
Right. Right.
So,
the preconceived ideas can throw you off.
Right.
They can really throw you off and block you in to where you can't see what's right in front of you and what's being in evidence right before you.
And I think humans would have, inherently some preconceived notions approaching any sort of investigation. But then if you are genuinely honest, you'll recalibrate your understanding with additional information.
Oh yeah. Well, I personally, I do that all the time with everything. I mean, it's like I tell people, I say, I don't, there are a lot of times where I don't even know if I could say I agree with myself 100% of the time, because I find out new details and new facts and new understanding, and the perspective changes because there's a new element brought in. There's a new fact. There's something. There's a new piece of evidence that may indicate maybe what I thought wasn't the case, and maybe this is the case. So we have to work with what we have, but it's very good to take stock of what we really have, and it's not, it's a good thing.
I use the analogy with investigations is almost like the same with the intelligence community of gathering the information. The analogy, comparing it to pixels on a screen, TV screen or computer screen. If you're talking about a 4K HD image, man, that's crystal clear. But if you only have a few hundred dots on a big screen TV, that's not a lot of information. That may not look like much of anything, but as you populate more of those pixels, you begin to understand more and more about the image until finally it's so populated you can tell very clear.
You can tell clearly,
almost like living with someone for a lifetime. You're going to learn more and more about them as you. And the first
bit that a lot of times we don't understand is that we are, whether willfully or just accidentally, but a lot of times we're just being deceived, because we're only getting a little tiny bit of information here, there, and we paint even when we're just painting our own conclusions, they're very possibly going to be the wrong conclusions. As if you had the Wheel of Fortune and you only had like one or two letters and you had a big paragraph. It's very difficult to tell what that means. The more letters that are up there, the more you can get the answer, the correct answer.
Yes, sir. The totality of circumstances, all of the information. Well, the shroud, as I understand it, and again, correct me if I get any of these wrong. The shroud was laid in the tomb, and then the body. I'm going to say the body, just for clarity on how this investigation was done. The body was laid on the shroud, and then the shroud was folded in half. The one half was laid over the top of the body. And if I remember correctly, you said that you can tell that the body was not then moved. That once they laid the body down, they laid it in the position that they intended. They laid the other half of the shroud, the top, over, and then it was not adjusted. You could tell by the way that there was no smearing on the blood stains. And is that accurate?
Yeah. I'll show you. I have this little cloth here, a little tiny shroud here. The body was laid down like this. And my tip of my fingers would be the head, laid down like this on the. If I could hold this just this way, and then the top of the cloth. The cloth is long like this. The body was laid down with my tip of my fingers being the head. The cloth was laid over like that, so it wasn't wrapped around like you would think a mummy. It was wrapped like this. But once the body was laid in the cloth like this, then the cloth was, we could tell that the cloth was not lifted from the body. Again, the body was not moved within the cloth. There was no movement relative to the body at all. And we can tell that from, there was no movement at all. We can tell that from the blood stains, from the blood clots. And because there's no smearing, there's no breakage of them. Even if you had lifted up the cloth or moved the body even the slightest bit, there would be smearing and breaking of the clots. But there's none of that. So we know that neither the cloth nor the body was moved once they were together, just stayed that way. And yet we also know that the body was only in the cloth for 36 hours. How do we know that? Well, because there was no decomposition on the cloth. And after 36, a couple of ways. One, after 36 hours, there would be decomposition, but also the blood clots. You know how, Craig, if you've been in combat, right? So if you have a wound or a scratch, even, you can look at it and say, oh, I just realized I'm cut right here. But that's an old cut. I mean, that must have done that yesterday, or that must be really fresh. I must have just done that. You can tell even by just looking at a cut or a wound how old it is.
Sure.
Because it's just, we have a sense of that. But pathologists can look at it and tell you that was 13 hours ago. And it's because of the fibrin in the blood and how the clotting is going. It takes place over a period of time. So they're able to tell that because the shape and size of the blood clots and the blood formation itself, that it was no less than 36 hours, not too much less than 36 hours, and not too much more than 36 hours when the body was no longer there. Had it been more or less, the blood clots would look different. But then the question is, well, if the body was only in the cloth for 36 hours, but the cloth was never moved and the body was never moved, wait a minute, how could what happened to the body then? Where'd the body go after 36 hours? How was it moved? I mean, did somebody pull it? They couldn't pull it out because it would have smeared. There's no smear.
It would have shown on the garment, yeah. Right?
So it was, the cloth was not moved, the body was not moved, but the body was only there for 36 hours. How can both of those things be?
Yeah, it's perplexing. I mean, I find it a fascinating problem to try to solve, and to learn about your study is mind-blowing for me, to say the least. Well, talk to me then next about the body being in fact dead when it was laid on the shroud, and what evidence painted that picture for you?
Yeah, well, there are people that I've heard who will say, well, now just as a quick rundown, I've had people say to me, well, there wasn't really blood, it was paint on the there's red paint on the shroud. And let me just tell you unequivocally, there is no paint on the shroud. There is no paint in the image area at all. There's no paint. What looks like blood is blood. It has been tested to be blood, and it's type AB blood. It's got both X and Y chromosomes, so it's from a male. And I've heard people say, well, the body, this man, whoever he was, and that's, I just might say that one of the things that I really liked about the physicists and the scientists and the pathologists and the medical doctors and the cardiologists and on and on and on that I dealt with, they didn't look at it like as a religious object or a religious study, and they even referred in very sort of scientific terms, they referred to the image as the man of the shroud or the victim. They never, because they said, we don't have a test who it is. There's no name tag on it.
Right.
So we can't tell that, but we tell there was a human here. There was, but they, I've heard people say, well, he wasn't really dead. The people, not the scientists that I talked to, but other people in the media said, well, he was probably alive. He was in a coma. Well, let me just assure you, this man whose image is on this cloth was dead. he was dead. He was not living. There are wounds on here that were made post-mortem, including a stabbing in the between the right in the right ribs, between the fifth and sixth rib, with about a 9-inch spear in an upward that went through the lung and through the right lung and into the heart. And that wound was post-mortem. We can tell because there's no swelling in that area, there's no bruising in that area, and the lung did not collapse. So this was, and there are other wounds that we can tell the blood came out, and that's a post-mortem wound, and other wounds that we can tell that you can see where it was pumping out. You could see halos of serum, and you can tell what was going on. The separation of the blood from the serum, et cetera, and the clotting, some of which is only visible and under high magnification through fluorescence photography, and is not visible to the naked eyes. But also what I got from the pathologist is a report, pathology report of what happened to the body. Without going through and reading, and I could read it for you if you like. It's one page, but in short, there were a lot of things going on, and a lot of trauma going on in this body. But the ultimate cause of death was called multifactorial, culminating in a condition known as cardiac tamponade or hemopericardium, which is generally the final stage of a myocardial infarction or a heart attack. There was so much stress. There was what's called blunt chest trauma, with the repeated falling with the weight of a crossbeam, and it wasn't the entire cross; it was just the crossbeam that someone would carry. And Dr. William Edwards from the Mayo Clinic, this is a quote, says that the death was brought about by multifactorial causes related primarily to hypovolemic shock, exhaustion, asphyxia, and ultimately acute heart failure. A fatal cardiac arrhythmia accounted for a catastrophic death. It was incredibly painful, this death. Crucifixion was an incredibly painful form of death. It was so horrendous that it was outlawed a few hundred years later. But crucifixion was actually a form of terrorism. Crucifixion was, so that everybody would know what you did, and the body would be left up there for days in a lot of cases, so that anyone coming in or out of town, and it was near the entrance to town, anyone coming in and out would see, oh look, Craig Sawyer stole a goat. And this is, or he made fun of the emperor. This is his punishment. Let's not do that. And so
yeah,
that's
but he was a bad emperor.
He was a bad emperor, and but it was a horrendous death. But because of what happened, the body honestly had no chance. And in fact, people would die from the scourging. They scourged him first, and people would go home and die from that a few hours later. But they scourged him and they crucified him, which was in and of itself really there was no chance for him to live.
You talked about the scourging. Describe that a little bit. Some of my understanding is that you guys could even determine that there were two soldiers who whipped him, one slightly taller than the other.
Yeah, there were two soldiers, and they had an instrument like this. I recreated it. These straps on the flagrum, they would call it, or will actually be made of leather, but I made them of rope. But then there would be these little look like dumbbells at the very end, and they would break open the skin. And we can tell that there are two men. There are about 120 wounds visible. We can only see the ones that broke the skin, but there were two men we can tell that were standing about 45 degrees, about 2 feet away from him at a 45-degree angle. The man on the left was a little bit taller than the man on the right that was scourging him. The scourging, they would lash you. They weren't allowed to kill you with the scourging on the spot, but they could give you these lashes that would. And here's the thing, on this video, I can't really show you. but if you get hit with this, it's like getting hit with a bullet. I mean, this is horrendous to hear this, like hit a cardboard box or something like that. It's very, very frightening, and blood would be splattering all over the place. But what they found is that they didn't have to kill you with that. You would go home and die a couple hours later from kidney failure, from all these toxins in the body. It raised your potassium levels, etc. And you would die of a heart attack from this, if nothing else. And but with the crucifixion, it was incredible strains on the body, that blunt chest trauma repeatedly, and then with the additional trauma and stress on the body, then the heart basically at one point, just the only way I know to say it is basically the heart ruptured, and there was death, but there was agony up until that point.
Well, I've looked at images of the shroud,
Mm-hmm.
and in certain enhancement, it causes those scourge wounds to be more visible. And
Right.
for crying out loud, they're all up and down, not just the back, but the front of the torso, and the front and the back of the legs, and the front and the back of the arms.
He could barely walk. His hamstrings were, really beat up, and so he could I mean, we had this image of him walking. He was staggering.
Yeah.
He was staggering. He could barely walk a few steps without falling. I know in our tradition, they say Jesus fell 3 times. In reality, he probably fell every other step. He fell repeatedly. And so, there's a lot of details that we can tell, all the way through that process, because it's recorded. All of this is recorded on the shroud. If you know how to look at the evidence and interpret it and see what's really there and what's not there.
Well, next seems to come up in a natural sequence is the dust on the,
there's dirt.
I believe it's on certain parts that match certain geo locations there. Will you just touch on that for a minute?
Yeah, there's dirt on his right knee. There's dirt on his feet. There's dirt on his nose and face. And this is all consistent with him falling face first without the ability to catch himself. The crossbeam was put behind his back, and it's called the patibulum. And it was very heavy. It would weigh 150, 160 pounds. He was about 5'9.25", weighed probably about 175 pounds, very, very much in shape, very good diet, vital. You can tell this is a very healthy person, Sephardic Jewish. And we can tell sort of like from the bone structure. And he fell many times, and when he would fall, he couldn't catch himself. So he would hit his chest on the ground, and the crossbeam would be another 160 pounds coming on top of him. And like I say, his hamstrings and all were destroyed in the scourging. So he was having a hard time. But the dirt on the nose and the right knee is consistent with dirt from Jerusalem, especially when you take out modern day pollutants. Then the chemical makeup of that dirt is consistent with the dirt that's still there. And so it was, that's interestingly enough, a little bit of a side note, because of the way certain things happen like that, we can assume, once again, we don't have facts and figures and all that, because that's not on the shroud, but there are a few assumptions. Everything I'm telling you is because there are facts. There's data, a multitude of data to back it up. There are a few things that I've come up with an opinion about, and I'm telling you, I'll tell you, well, this is my opinion based on some of the things, but one of the opinions that I came to is that he was probably right-handed, just based on the position of the crossbeam and the way it was placed on him and the way he fell and the dirt on the right knee, a few things like that. give me the indication that he may have been right, a dominant, right-handed. Not that that matters or anything, but these are the level of details that we can go in, that we have.
Yeah, it's all very interesting to me. I mean, the more you know.
This was a real person.
Yeah,
A real guy.
that, yeah, somebody went through this, and the shroud reveals
And by the way, we have thousands and thousands of burial cloths from that era. None of them with this image on it, except for this one.
And they is it true that they cannot create that type of image even today with any of our modern technology? They cannot. There are aspects of the image and the way that it is on the linen that we cannot create no matter what we use.
Right. A lot of people think it was, they think, well, something was added to the cloth. I've heard a lot of people say, well, it had to be Leonardo da Vinci, which means that Leonardo da Vinci, and believe me, I'm Italian. I'm 100% Italian. So, what's not to love about Leonardo da Vinci? But Leonardo da Vinci would have not only had to have, there's only two chances he could have done it. One is he had to have done this by defying all the laws of physics when he was 3 years old, because we know that the shroud was described when Leonardo da Vinci was 3. But because of other scientific facts, we know that Leonardo da Vinci would have had to actually get in a time machine, go backwards for about 1,000 years and 1,500 years, and then resurrect somebody from the dead in order to create this image. Because we can't even produce that image now with the type of details that are on it. There's been a great deal of speculation about the possibility of the shroud being produced by an artist in the Middle Ages. I hear this a lot, especially around Easter time. You start hearing about, it was this art professor at so-and-so college has figured out how the shroud was made. It was done by photography. Well, it's important to note that in the Middle Ages, the concept of photography and photographic negativity wasn't even imagined, let alone understood. So if there had been an artist, he or she would have had to not only grasp such a radical concept, would have had to have also hoped that somebody would eventually invent photography, which did happen 500 years later. But otherwise, nobody would even be able to view the shroud image in focus. So, the alleged artist would have had to envision and then, encode all these microscopic details that would remain invisible for centuries. And then he'd have no way to actually see if he got it right, because there was no photography. There was no such thing as a photographic negative. So despite the tendency to assume otherwise, somebody like that, or couldn't have tricked anybody at the time, and certainly couldn't have tricked anybody now. And they tried to reproduce it, and coming to the conclusion that you can't do it now.
Yeah, it wasn't stained. There was no pigment. They didn't burn it on. There was so many experiments have been tried, and they can't do it. And
there's no paint, there's no dyes, there's no pigments, there's no compounds found in the universe that could have created this. And I don't say that lightly. There's no image, there's no compounds found in the universe that could have created this image on the cloth. It can't be washed or bleached off, which it tells us it's not created by the application of dyes or paints. There's no directionality on it. There's no brush strokes. So in other words, if I'm going to paint a picture, the first thing I do is I touch the paintbrush, and then I move it. Well, there's a directionality, left to right, right to left, up, down, whatever. Some people say, oh, it's dust. Well, if I or like silk screening or something like that. Well, no matter what you do, there's a directionality. In here, there's no directionality of the image. In fact, the JPL actually went and removed all the weave of the shroud and all the dirt and all the blood particle, everything off of it, and just left the image and a computer simulation, and found that there was no directionality at all. And I'll read you the quote from JPL. They said, what we found that there was no directionality, no brush strokes, finger strokes, or any sign of application of the image by artificial methods. This image, however it got there, was not applied to the cloth by any method possible for a human according to the laws of physics. The notion that someone may have painted it or applied heat or dust or something like that is simply wrong. This is not a painting or a creation of man. A man couldn't have done it. It's impossible.
Wow. And
A
again,
man created the cloth, but a man could not have created the image. We still can't do it today, and nobody did it then. It can't be done, but it's there.
again, for everybody else's edification, JPL being.
Jet Propulsion Laboratory
Okay.
in Pasadena.
All right. So there you go. It's all fascinating to me. Is there anything to be said about the bilirubin and the body chemistry, the postmortem chemistry?
Yeah, there's elevated bilirubin count in the blood, and that indicates that there was trauma. This man died a violent death. So that's another indicator. Another thing is that like I said, a lot of these things are only visible through infrared, ultraviolet photography and high magnification. One of the things that's interesting is the image is anatomically correct. And even subtle features that are not visible to the naked eye are there, and they're correct. And you have to remember, people even 100 years ago didn't have the understanding of the human body and anatomy the way we do now. They didn't really understand. I mean, you think back, it's not that long ago when they were putting leeches and, cutting you open if you had a fever, and they didn't really understand the way things were put together. Even in this case, it says reactions to the human body to stress, beating, and crucifixion are recorded perfectly, some not visible to the naked eye and only through magnified and enhanced infrared photography. This centuries before mankind understood the response of the human body to such conditions. So, and also this is interesting, and we'll get into this, but we also know that the blood, there's an image. And remember, I said there's blood. There's an XY chromosomes, type AB blood. Well, this is interesting to note. We know this for a fact. The blood went onto the cloth before the image went onto the cloth. There's a cloth. There's an image on it, and there's blood on it. But the blood, we could tell the order. The blood went on first, and then the image went on after the blood. We can tell this because if you flake off a little bit of the blood and look under it, then there's no image underneath that. So the blood is actually blocking the mechanism that makes the image. So the blood had to be there first.
Wow.
So the idea that, you could, so if there's a supposed artist, they had to put the blood on there first, and it was real blood. Elevated bilirubin count, which means it was from somebody who was traumatized. And then they had to put an image and hope that blood matched up to some image that they were drawing or do. It just doesn't. What people propose happen is actually physically impossible.
Yeah. Well, that's useful information to consider and recalibrate from. So that's one of the reasons I was so excited to have this conversation. And that image on the shroud, it's not in the heavy linen. It's not in the middle of the fibers. It's not even on the outer fibrils. It's on the outer tips of the finest fuzz at the very edge, right? Fibrils.
Right. It's on the very edge of the cloth, and it's what we call the top fibrils. It's never deeper than a few microns. And let's say that my arm is a thread. Okay. Well, but the hair on my arm would be the fibrils. So not even on the top threads. It's just on the top parts of the top threads. The top fiber, it never goes deeper than a few microns, and interestingly enough, it's invisible within 6 feet. So it's because of a phenomenon called neural lateral inhibition. It goes invisible. You get within 6 feet of it, and I have been within 6 feet of it. You can't see the image. It's invisible. You just see the blood. And so this supposed artist, had he done it, then he had to do it from further than 6 feet away, and had to do things on a microscopic level as a photographic negative. And that's just, with the blood being up there first and things that you wouldn't be able to see, even if you had photography 500 or 600 years later, you would only be able to still only see certain aspects of it. Some of the most striking things with high magnification and infrared photography, not even visible to the naked eye. So because of this, it's actually unimaginable, to think that somebody actually may have done this. It's not possible for a human to have done this.
It's important to say it and walk people through like this, because again, if people are honest and they're unbiased and they follow the evidence and consider the totality of the circumstances, there begins to be painted a very clear picture of what took place. And I celebrate exploring it and measuring and studying and wherever it leads. But it's just, to me, it's inspiring to learn what all has come out of this, and without beating you to death to pull some of this information out. I'm having a good time getting through it. I hope other people are gaining a lot out of it. I'm learning, even with as much as I've chatted with you before, I'm learning a lot more right now, chatting with you, new stuff.
Thank you.
I mean,
Good.
there's a
Good.
vast amount of information that
Yes.
you've learned from it. So
It's one thing there's no shortage of is information. Just wish people had the correct information.
I'm marking off my notes as we've talked about some of these things. We've covered a lot of ground already.
Yeah.
The legs. So it was standard that the Romans would eventually break the lower legs, was it not? When they were crucifying, just to go ahead and put an end to it. Dinner's time's coming where we've had enough of this. Let's let these guys go ahead and suffocate. And
you couldn't. They basically had one nail here, and by the way, the nail was through the wrist. The nail was. Let me see here. I do have sometimes a nail, but I don't have one with me. But it's basically, it looked like this. It was about this long. This is a pen, but it was about this big, but it was square. And it wasn't through the hands, because it was known. And it's still, if you try to hang somebody that'll just fall. That'll just come right out. You'll just tear through. But here, there's a space called the space of I call it destot. I don't know exactly how you pronounce it. Maybe it's destot, DESTOT. And it's where 4 bones are there, and the nail went through there and in each wrist. One nail here, one nail here. And by the way, it cut the nerve there, and it didn't sever it, but it cut the nerve, and it caused excruciating pain. Like just as a matter of fact, excruciating is a Latin word. It means from the cross. When we talk the word excruciating, that's where that word comes from. So this was the original excruciating pain from the cross, because it cut that nerve, or severed it, not completely, but partially. So there was still feeling in it, which made it worse, and like lightning shooting through. And then there was one other nail that went through the feet, from the one foot placed on top of the other, and the nail that went through the top of the foot, and through the bones there, and then out through the heel of the other foot, and then into the wood. So those are the only 3 points where somebody can pull up. And you had to pull up a couple of inches at least to breathe. And so what they would do is, after a while, they would, if they weren't dead already, they would go through and break their legs, so they couldn't push up anymore, and they would die. And like I say, usually they would leave the bodies up there for. Sometimes people would hang on the cross for days before they died. But sometimes they, like you say, it was, they wanted it to be over with. Let's go. Yeah. Let's make sure everybody's dead. And they would go through and just start breaking legs, so that they couldn't do it. In the case of, in this particular case, no bones were broken. We could tell that cartilage in the nose was mangled a bit, misplaced, or, pushed around. And that's probably from the falls, but no bones were broken. The legs were not broken. And, yet there's this wound in the side. And I'd always sort of assumed that the wound in the side, which we see on crucifixes and paintings of Jesus, was that, some sign of cruelty or disrespect. But in fact, archaeology and history taught me that it really wasn't a sign of disrespect or cruelty. It was to make sure that he was dead, so that they could release the body. Right. Otherwise, they would just leave it up there. And if the family wanted the body, they would release the body, but they had to make sure he was dead. There was no attending physician going around, seeing how people were doing and making sure if they were alive or dead. So what they would do is basically a coup de grace. They would, and we could, it's interesting the detail we can tell here. We know it was a Roman soldier about 5'10", staying about 4 or 5 feet away, and with a lance, pushed the lance. It's like a 9-inch blade, went in, like I mentioned before, through the rib cage, went through the right lungs into the heart. This is a post-mortem wound, and when he pulled it out, a lot of the blood had already congealed, and a lot of the serum had already been squeezed, if that's the right word, out of the heart, and blood and serum came out. So it looked like blood and water coming out and gushed out and just fell by gravity down to the ground. And it's amazing. I won't get all into it here because it just takes too much time, but the amount of detail that we can tell about that particular blood. And but then he was pronounced dead. You could take the body, and so that's why the body would be released that night or that afternoon to the family, and then they could have a burial. They could do whatever they wanted with it.
But his legs were not broken.
Legs were not broken.
As was the custom, though, was to generally the legs were broken.
Break the legs so that so that they're not gonna live more than a few minutes after that.
Let me ask you this point blank, Jack, because there are others that out there that may want to ask the question: what of the shroud? What evidence of the shroud refutes what is in the Bible?
None of it.
Thank you, sir. All right, let's continue on.
And I actually went through a whole bunch of things like, no, no, none of it.
Yeah,
it does.
What I find is that it amplifies
what's
in the Bible. It gives additional information. It may be a little bit different than we imagined it.
Right. Because we imagine stuff through paintings and through statues and things like that. And so when we look back and, like, for example, the nail wounds in the wrist, that was what really happened in crucifixions all the way across the board. They never did that. The Romans knew better. They knew not to do that. But, so in ancient times, the wrist was considered part of the hand. So they say
the language included the wrist.
That meant this isn't the hand, and it was from here on. And so, certain things like that, it basically just clarified some things like, oh, that makes perfect sense, as opposed to what we might have thought or just gotten the perception of through artwork or stuff like that, which is the artwork was the imagination part. This is the real stuff.
Truly. We've covered scourging and the nail holes. Fantastic. The way that went through the feet. There was one you were telling me more recently, because I had misunderstood before that because one of the nails was through the side of the heel, that they did actually use one nail for both feet, but that it went through the top of one foot and then through
they put the nail,
heel
of
the other
through.
Kind of, is that?
Yeah, they put the nail through, and then they put that foot on top of the other foot, and they nailed it straight into the beam. Okay. Into the cross. Wow. And by the way, the cross was like this. It was like a this. Okay. Like a towel, as opposed to, we always see crosses that look like this. Right. The cross looks like this. And then above that would be the what they call the titulum, which would be the little sign that tells you what your offense was. Right. So it would be this with the little thing sticking up from here that says, in this case, this man, this is not on the shroud, but this is, what we've typically known is that this man claimed to be the king of the Jews, but in your case, it would be spoke bad about the emperor or stole a goat, or whatever it is that you did. Yeah, that's what it would be. And so if you look at the totality, it does look like the cross that we see as a cross. Yeah. But in fact, visually, the cross beam was just set on top of the stipes, the one in the ground, which was always there. The one in the ground was always there. And because they used this over and over. They didn't just have this one crucifixion. They crucified a lot of people all the time.
Wow. So they may have
form of terrorism.
Nailed the hands while he was on the ground and then lifted him, and then they would have nailed the feet.
and
to
then lift
the
the whole thing
vertical
up,
beam.
set it on top of there, and then nail the feet in.
Wow. What a brutal and ugly and just hateful death.
I've heard that they did a study at one of the universities, and they actually tied people to a cross. They made them comfortable. They didn't make it where they were suffering. There was no nails or anything, but they tied them with padding and everything, put them on a cross, and just to see the psychological response. And they said that people, even and they knew they could be saved at any moment. Like, I guess there was a safe word or something where they could say, "Get me down," and they would cut them down. But yet they said they were traumatized up there because there was such this feeling of abandonment and loneliness. And even though there were people around them, it's like it was an interesting psychological experiment to be tied to a cross. And even without the residual pains and beatings and all that beforehand and scourging, but just to be there and so helpless, tied to there. And by the way, when you're hanging from a cross, you're not hanging just vertically, you're hanging forward. Your body starts to lean forward because it becomes, you have to be incredibly strong and acrobatic to hold yourself straight. Your body will lean forward, which puts incredible stresses like on the arm itself, because of the angle that the arm was at. There were about 240 pounds per arm of force being pulled. And so it does incredibly difficult things, to your body. And it's
difficult to breathe.
difficult.
Wow. And
impossible to breathe. Yeah, you have to pull yourself up to breathe. You have to lift up to breathe, which is, you've seen the guys in the Olympics with the rings and how difficult it is for them to hold that. And these are trained to do that. And yet, and they have, they're grabbing it with their hands as opposed to with a nail through the wrist.
Lifting yourself on nails through your wow.
Torture over and over. And this went on for hours before the actual death.
The nose, you were saying you guys could tell that the nose cartilage was damaged,
right?
As if obviously from beating,
from hitting the ground, and also from hitting. We know that we could tell that he was hit with a club of some sort, like here in the face. The lip is swollen. There's a black eye, and the nose, the cartilage is dislocated. So he was beaten from the front. There's a wounds consistent with a what we typically call a crown of thorns, which, by the way, was incredibly unusual in ancient Israel, or in the crucifixions. There's no other evidence or any mention of anybody else being beaten, scourged, crucified, and crowned with thorns. Only one case that we have of that being recorded. And in this particular case, I know that in artwork and in statues, et cetera, we see this little sort of nice little crown of thorns. That's not what it was like. The evidence on the shroud, the image and the blood stains around the head tell us that it was more like a helmet, and it was woven from something called thorn bushes that are found in that area, and they're called Ziziphus spina, and the thorns are or so inches long and razor sharp. So a lot of times not just around the edges of the head, but all over the head, and was probably beat down and then tied down again just to make sure it stayed there. And there we can see where it actually went under the skin and into the scraped this between the skin and the skull, and the head bleeds very voluminously, because you need a lot of blood and oxygen going to your brain. So there's a lot of blood coming from the head and the hair and all in the front and the back.
Yeah. Wow, man.
Incredibly
so
painful.
Again, it's not doesn't refute what's in the Bible. It gives additional information. Yeah, there's a crown of thorns, and in fact, here's what it really looked like.
It's worse than you thought. Yeah, in a lot of ways. I'll say this because I'm not a theologian, but in a lot of ways, our concept of crucifixion itself, I'll put it that way, we've sanitized it a lot.
Yeah.
Because it was incredibly horrific, incredibly brutal. And like I say, I think in the year 350 or somewhere along this, it was outlawed completely because it was just too much. It's just too cruel. Although I think there are some places where they still do it on Earth. But
so this guy, whoever was
victim.
put in this shroud was mocked as a king, because as you said,
The crown.
yeah. And again, it wasn't common. It's not like you guys are finding any other shrouds with any of that sort of indication. So, and the DNA of the mother could be ascertained from the blood on this shroud. Is that true?
Yeah, I have, let me just say this. I've held a piece of the blood in my hands, and I've talked to physicists, et cetera, about the blood and the DNA. I will tell you this for now. I'll give you more information later, but I will tell you this for now is that they were asked not to do intensive DNA studies. Let's just say the DNA studies may have been done. So I'll give you more
Ooh.
information on what was found,
Okay.
but not today.
Okay.
Not
Fair
right
enough.
now. Not
Fair
right now.
enough. Huh.
But it's kind of incredible. I'll just say it's amazing. And I'm coming at it from just a scientific point of view. It's
Okay.
amazing.
All right. Fair enough.
But there are XY chromosomes, so it is a human male.
Right. Okay.
So we'll take it that next step in another show.
Okay.
At
All
another
right.
time.
So I think let's get into, we've talked about the image, the wounds and the biochemistry, the no directionality of the image. I think we've covered a lot of this. Now let's get into the quantum physics, if you will, the quantum mechanics, and what's really going to rock people and blow their minds. We kind of needed to cover this to get here.
Right.
And if there's any key thing that we should have covered before we go into this next part, Jack, please let me know. Otherwise, I think we're pretty much ready to go there.
Okay. One thing I'll tell you this is, as we said before, attempts to duplicate the image don't work. And every Easter, ABC News and NBC News and this news and that news and the other news will put on some professor from some art school somewhere who says, I have created an image. I have figured out how the Shroud of Turin image came to be. And they'll say, how did you do it, professor? And he'll say, well, I have in my laboratory or outside in the playground, I've put a cloth down and I created an image with 2 or 3 characteristics that are the same as the Shroud of Turin. And they'll say, that's amazing. So you're able to do it. So it was very possible for someone in the Middle Ages to do it. It must be a fake, etc. Well, here's the thing. I'll just tell you right now. The professor who does that did not really do it. He's not able to do it because for many reasons. One is that we know that there were they'll say it was oils or vapor. There's no oils on the cloth. There's no oils on the cloth. There's no compound added to the cloth. There's nothing that soaks through the cloth other than blood. There's no vapors. It was not caused by vapors. It was not caused by dust. It was not caused by lightning. It was not caused by corona discharge, where some people say there's no pigments, there's no compounds on the cloth that created that image. And also, the image has characteristics. There are certain characteristics that are on that cloth that I'll just give you a few of the characteristics that are on the cloth. Like we talked about it before. It's only on the top. The image is only on the top fibrils. It's ghostly. You can't even see it within 6 feet. There's nothing added to the cloth. There's no material added to produce the image. It's composed of degraded cellulose. There's no image underneath the blood. These are all facts. There's no image underneath the blood. The image itself is directionless. There's no direction of application. It's invisible within 6 feet. Remember that? The
Yeah.
front of the image is very focused, like an X-ray. The back of the image, remember I had that cloth over, and the back would be here. If if this is, once again, this is the body with my fingers being the head. This is the front. He's laying face up. The cloth is like this. The front of the image would be in here, and the back of the image would be here. So
Right.
the front of the image here is very focused, like an X-ray. The back of the image is a little more blurred. Just a fact. We also know that there are no side image. We know that whatever formed this image only acted in an up and down direction. In other words, it wasn't a burst of radiation. It wasn't light flying in all directions. Whatever caused this image to be on the cloth only acted in an up and down direction, only. And we also know that there's only one force. There are only like four, everything I'm saying is very simplified, but there's only, there's four forces: electromagnetic force, gravity, and the strong force, the weak force. But only one force known to man acts exclusively in an up-down direction relative to the Earth, and that is gravity.
Yep.
Gravity, up and down. What goes up must come down. And so it also has 3D characteristics encoded on this image. There's 3D, so you could take this image, you could scan it, and not just have a two-dimensional image. You could have a three-dimensional, like a man. You could go around him and look at him, and you could see it. Also, it's a photographic negative. The first photograph, it's a photographic negative. So think about what I'm saying. It's from the 1st century, and it's a photographic negative. So I mean, I joke sometimes. I say, well, that was the first selfie. Okay, this is a photograph of that man, and it's on an image, and there's no chemicals or anything that would create that would make it a photograph. People have said, well, it's sulfur. There's no sulfur on the cloth. There's nothing that could create an image. I've even heard people say, like some of these professors will say, well, it was made with urine. Okay, well, there's no urine on the cloth. We could tell if there were urine. I mean, none of these chemicals are on the cloth. There's no alcohol. There's nothing of this on the cloth. And all the anatomical features are perfectly recorded at that moment. So these are characteristics. Now, what I say is, like, this quote unquote professor who says, I can replicate the shroud. He may have 2 characteristics that match. Like it's sort of a photographic negative, or it's sort of this or sort of that. Okay, well, come up with this list right here, because it's got to match all of these. It's got to be directionless. It's got to be invisible within 6 feet. It's got to be a photographic negative. It's got to be focused on the front, not the back. It's got to be have 3D characteristics. It's got to be only on the top fibrils, and none of theirs are. So I tell people, it's like, anybody who claims that, they're just claiming like 1 or 2 characteristics, as opposed to all that you would need. So it'd be like me saying, you know what? A light bulb here, the light bulb in your room has 2 characteristics exactly like the sun. It gives off light and gives off heat. And so therefore, that light bulb is the sun. Well, no, it's not. So there's 2 characteristics that are the same. There are a bunch more that are not.
Right.
So also, if I said, you know what, I have a broken down Yugo or a broken down VW Bug from 1960, out in the driveway, but it has 2 characteristics exactly like a brand new Rolls Royce. It has a steering wheel and a seat, and a passenger seat. Well, okay, so it has 2 characteristics like a Rolls Royce, but nothing else like you won't mistake the 2. So unless it has all of those characteristics, then it was not created by this professor's wrong, and they're always wrong, and I can always spot it immediately. But yet they want to trumpet this out like Christianity is a fake. And to me, I don't look at it like, they're saying Christianity is a fake, but they're saying this science is fake. And I'm going to show you two pixels of this picture, and then I'm going to make you draw a conclusion and act like, no, that's not. Let me show you the whole picture, and then you can draw your own conclusion. But So this idea that man can create it, it cannot be done. But what can create it? What could have created it? And that's where we had to go backwards and start looking at, what is this image? How did it get on? How did it not get on first? That's what we had to answer. How did it not get on the cloth? Well, it was not by adding any element or compound. It was not by paint. It was not by this. It was not by lightning. It was not by all these other methods that, because they don't match the characteristics. The same characteristics don't match up. So we could eliminate all those, and so what did cause it? And there's the question. And how was it able that this body, was able to be in that cloth for only 36 hours and then not be there?
Yeah.
And
Not
what could have
not
happened?
moved in the way that we understand moving a body, but yet no longer there.
No longer there, and yet not moved.
Yeah, that's an interesting dilemma to try to solve scientifically.
Right. So that's what we decided to do.
All right.
Solve that. So I guess you want to know how that happened.
I want to know how that
You look
happened.
like you had that look on your face, like, well,
This is what gets to the good stuff. I mean, just mind blowing. And I'll say this: as a Christian, I don't need an artifact to hang my faith on.
Right.
I don't need that. I would have faith no matter what.
Right.
But I think that it's pretty cool that this artifact was left with so much evidence that tells us, that confirms so many things. And it's just, I think it's cool. And so there's nothing wrong with exploring it and even celebrating how much it reveals. But without further ado, I'll let you continue, sir.
Okay. Now, what I'm about to say, and I've said this in lectures in Vienna and all over this country and in different places in Europe, and I'll say it here, that what I'm about to say, and this is going to even be more so the case, is an incredible oversimplification. Okay. I'm just going to apologize ahead of time. What I'm about to say is an incredible oversimplification. So forgive me, ahead of time for.
But that's out of practical necessity, right? Though, as far as to break it down for the time that we have.
Like Richard Feynman would say, you could make things be very, very difficult, but you just get to the heart of the matter, and this is the way it boils down, and it's so I will tell you this: there was a 5th century, in the 5th century BC, there was a Greek named Democritus, and he was quoted as saying, "Nothing exists except atoms and space. Everything else is opinion." Everything else is opinion. So they had this notion, and even in the 5th century before Christ, of atoms existing. Now, when you look at something, you don't see atoms.
Right.
You see a piece of wood or a piece of cloth. You don't see atoms. You see an object. None of us experience that. We never see them. We don't know what they, we have. Now we kind of know that they exist and that type of thing, but it's not something you see experimentally just with your eyes. So that's one thing to think about. And by the way, an atom, we have this idea of an atom with it'd be like a golf, or like my ring, it'd be about that size, or a grape. And then it'll, we see a picture, it'll have all these little electrons floating around, running around it and circling like planets.
Right.
Well, that's just for visual. That's not really the way it is. It's more like the electrons go around and sort of form a cloud and all these other things. But basically, you have this little nucleus, and then the nucleus is protons and neutrons, and then you have the little electrons spinning around it. Well, in fact, we see this thing. When we see pictures of it. It all looks very compact, but in fact, if you had the center portion, the protons and neutrons of the middle portion of an atom, as big as the size of a grape, then it's very possible that the closest electron to that would be 1 or 2 miles away when you expand it out to the size of a grape. So this is how much. So what you're saying is that an atom is mostly space.
Inherently empty space. Yeah.
It's mostly empty space, so, even if you pack it down, to the fractional, the ratio is mostly space. It's mostly space. And you have a lot of those together, but each one of them are mostly space. And so,
But isn't it the way that the electrons spin around the nucleus that cause us to have the understanding or the appearance of solid matter, that we can't put our hand through a desk or through a wall?
yeah, there's
But
a couple of
even
things.
though everything, it's mostly empty space, but isn't
Mostly
it
empty
because
space.
of the way that they
Right,
that
interact, the
orbit?
hand, the wall, and the pen, and everything is mostly empty space, but touching empty space. Okay, but because of that alignment, and also because of the electromagnetic forces, keep everything from going through each other, at least in our basic understanding. Like, you don't just fall through the floor because there's the electromagnetic forces, and even if you did so, once again, I'm oversimplifying it, but even if you touch two things together, the alignment of the atoms and the molecules, etc., even with all the empty spaces in there, are going to be different. And so they're going to block each other, and the electromagnetic forces keep it from going all the way through. Now, we do have cases that we do now, modern day, understand of one thing just passing through another unobstructed. Radio signals, television signals. There are television signals that are coursing through your body right now without your permission. There are all type of programs and things being done and said flying right through you that you don't even know about. You wouldn't even approve of, but they're going all over the place, and they come in through the room, and Wi-Fi, all this stuff that we have that, hey, can pass right through walls unobstructed. It's just as good on the other side of the wall as it is here. Would seem like magic to people a couple of hundred years ago, but
Yeah.
we are able to do it because we're able to understand that and harness it.
I'll blame
But
all my mistakes on that
don't
dynamic.
blame your mistakes on that. There's these television
Something
signals
flew
and
through me I
beams.
didn't authorize.
I didn't mean that. I didn't say that. That was that signal that came through. So another reason, another way to get out of stuff is to blame that. So you have the fact that atoms are mostly space, and so everything you see around you, whether it's the desk, the books behind you, or they're all mostly space, but they give the appearance to us of being solid, and they give the feel of being solid. So let's have that concept. Let's just sit down with that for a second, and then let's move over to something else. Time. What is time? I always ask people, what is time? It's not a philosophy. It's a measurement. Time is a measurement of change. There's a principle called the second law of thermodynamics, and it could be stated a lot of different ways, and it can be made to sound very confusing. But what it boils down to in very, very simple, oversimplified terms is this: everything left to itself tends toward disorder. If you leave something, it's just going to tend toward disorder. It's going to break down over time, basically, is what it's saying. And for example, if you, let's say you had that bookshelf behind you, and if we said, let's seal that thing off where nobody can touch it, but let's just fast forward and come back 500 years from now and take a look at that bookcase, it's probably going to be a shambles, even if nobody touched it, just because the wood is going to decompose over time. It's going to rot. All these things are going to happen. It's not going to get stronger. You're not going to come back 1,000 years from now and say, wow, that bookcase is a lot stronger than it was back when we made that video. No, it's going to deteriorate over time because things tend toward disorder in the known universe. Things tend toward disorder if left to themselves. Our bodies do that. We get older.
I know mine does.
Don't you know? Yeah. Start hitting these age marks. It's like, God, what is that? How is that? So, I mean, I took a nap once and somehow woke up. It was like 20 minutes. I twisted my back. And I'm thinking, I used to be able to sleep 8 hours without injury. And now I took a 20-minute nap and like my back hurts for some
It's
reason.
getting bad
So-
when you're injured and yourself sleeping, right?
Sleeping. Yeah. So, but it's just like, that's it. We die. We like the idea, at least, of dying of old age,
Yeah.
of old age, So this, we know this happens to things. We know if don't leave, here's an experiment for all the men out there. Don't do any yard work for the next 2 years. Tell your wives, this is a scientific experiment. You're not going to do any yard work, anything to repair anything for like let's just say 5 years, and see how things go awry, see how things take over and get out of hand, because you have to put energy into it to restore it constantly, or it will get disordered. It will get disordered. So this is true in our bodies. This is true in our landscapes. This is true in our vehicles. Everything we own is going to break down eventually.
Right.
Second law of thermodynamics tells us it will. It just will. So time is a measurement of that change. And the change is always in the direction of disorder. Time is a measurement of change. Change is always in the direction of disorder. So
Okay.
that's how we can, you look at a picture of somebody, look at two pictures of them, you can tell if one of them he was 8 years old, and the other one he's 45.
Right.
Time
Yeah.
has changed him. Okay, so
Yeah.
we know that.
Even the
we know that
pyramids weren't what they once were.
pyramids were fantastic when they were first built.
Yeah.
But they didn't build themselves.
Right.
Somebody had to do that, and so they had to put the energy in. They also needed to maintain it, which they didn't, and so they're not in their former glory. But if they, they'll continue. Everything on Earth continues to deteriorate, just the way it is. Okay. Here's another definition while we're thinking about it. So we have time, we have space, we have atoms. So here's another thing to think about. I was working at the University of Alabama, Birmingham once, and I asked some doctors there years ago. I was in college at the time. I said, let me ask you something. If you had two men, let's say they're twins, they're whatever, I don't know, give me 35 years old, twins, they're both lying on tables. One of them is alive and the other one's dead. What's the difference? What's the difference between those two guys? Just physically, what's the difference? And they thought about it. We thought it was just like a thought experiment, but the more we thought about it, the more we realized, I don't know. They both have the same exact chemical makeup. They both have the same exact DNA makeup. Their bodies were both functional, whatever, an hour ago, whatever. We just decided this guy's dead and this guy's not for the experiment. So what's the difference between those two? The same matter, pretty much, and one of them's living, one's dead. What's the difference? Well, we decided that the correct answer, and the medical doctors were like, I don't know, I'm just sort of trying to keep him alive, But I talked to physicists about that same question a few years later. We decided that the correct answer was one body is functional. It's ordered.
Right.
It's functional. It's able to perform the functions for which it was intended. The other body is not functional anymore. It's disordered. So we all have localized disorders. They're called diseases. They're caused by viruses. They're caused by injuries. They're caused by all those things. So these localized, a doctor once told me, he said, the 5 most dangerous words in the English language are maybe it will go away. Because if you have an injury or a growth or something wrong, just thinking that it might go away, it might get worse. It might metastasize. It might go into other organs and all this stuff. So you have to expend some type of energy to take care of it then. Otherwise, it will, a localized disorder may very often become a generalized disorder, which could lead to the ultimate disorder, which means everything starts to shut down in your body, your kidneys, your liver, your lungs, your heart, and then you are disordered. The ultimate disorder of a human or a living being is death.
Yeah.
Disorder. You're no longer capable. But then we also know, Craig, that the disorder does not stop there. Why? Because of the second law of thermodynamics. The disorder does not stop just because you're dead. You will continue the disorder according to the laws of physics and according to the second law of thermodynamics. So your body will, we don't think about this, but we know it, your body will decompose over time. It just will, and we have that saying, ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
Mm-hmm.
Because we know that that's that's
That's
what's
where
going to happen.
you're going. Yeah.
That's where you're going. We don't think about it,
Physically. Yeah.
but we know it's the case, and we
Sure.
don't, you don't hear people really complaining about it as if you had a choice, but that's the way it is. It's like you're gonna, even though your body is no longer ordered and you are at this completely disordered state of being what we call clinically dead, the universe is not finished with you yet. I mean, physics is not done with you yet. You're going to continue to follow those laws in disorder, 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 disorder. Okay. And that starts and it continues right at that atomic level, that smallest level. So I liken it to an analogy I use sometimes is, let's say when you're living, we're in this lobby of this incredible, beautiful building. And it's got everything you could ever imagine. It's got all of life. All of life we've ever known is in the lobby of this building. Everything, Earth, planets, everything that we know is in this lobby. And when we die, we're disordered. So we're put in the basement. We're no longer functioning here. We're put in the basement. But we don't just stay in the basement, because over time we start going lower and lower levels. Lower than that, we become, well, we decompose.
Right.
We turn
Right.
into that dust.
Yeah.
So, until there's nothing there. And so, that's one way to look at it. So we would imagine that this body then of this man who, like I say, was not in a coma, was not in a stupor, was not sleeping, was not hiding out. He was dead. He was dead when they put him in this tomb 2,000 years ago. He was dead. He was put in there. We would expect him to follow the second law of thermodynamics.
Right.
His
Begin
his
breaking
body was
down. Yeah.
to continue to break down, continue to break down. But like I said, we know that the body was only wrapped in that cloth 36 hours. There's no movement of cloth or body after that point, and there's no signs of decomposition. And just once again, just to reiterate, we know that the cloth, neither the cloth nor the body was moved, because if it had been moved, we could tell from the blood stains and the blood clots. We could tell, and once again, we know that it was only about that time, not too much shorter than that, not too much longer than that. And by the way, if this started on a Friday evening, 36 hours would be up early Sunday morning. So just to give you a time frame, on technically the third day.
Right.
First between Friday, Saturday, and then Sunday being the third day. So that's all right. So what could have happened? What may have happened? Well, in 1980, there were two men called Cronin and Fitch. They won the 1980. They won the Nobel Prize in physics for this. The question is, what in an atom. Let's see if I can explain this without getting too technically into the weeds. In the atom that we talked about is mostly space, right? It's got the nucleus made of protons and neutrons with their little electrons flying around it, and most of that is space. And yet we know that those are not the smallest particles. Those little particles are made up of other particles that are smaller.
Subatomic.
Yeah, subatomic particles, exactly. And so when you start getting into those particles, then you get into all the crazy names like kaons and bosons, and you get into a bunch of different types of particles with different, different properties. And some people will argue and they'll say, well, they're particles. No, they're actually waves. For the purposes of this, let's call them particles, because sometimes they act like particles, sometimes they act like waves, and okay. Doesn't matter, right? For the purposes of this, what purposes of this is there are these little entities, and I'm going to call them particles for now, that make up the particles that make up the atoms. Okay.
Fair enough.
So they, in 1980, Cronin and Fitch discovered that about 1 out of every 1,000, I think I'm correct on that, 1 out of every 1,000 of these little particles defies the second law of thermodynamics. In other words, instead of deteriorating into a lower order,
State.
into a lower orbit, instead of the scattering, like you would imagine the bookshelf would, it would just deteriorate over time. Instead of going to that lower order, which would be natural, which would follow the second law of thermodynamics, about 1 out of every 1,000 or so they measured actually goes to a higher level of order. It actually increases in strength. How could that be? Not one out of every billion or 100 billion, one out of every 1,000. I think it's either 1,000 or 10,000, but it's an extraordinary number.
I think 1,000 is what I remember.
1,000 is what I remember too. So it goes up to this. It goes up to a higher order, and without the addition of energy, you would think it can make it go up to a higher order, just like when we, make someone, heal someone or build something, but we have to input energy. Yeah, you have to fire. So in this case, not only without the addition of energy, but it actually gives off energy. It defies the second law of thermodynamics. And in these little particles,
I think you said once they misbehave according to what you understand about all the other particles and how they function. They misbehave, but yet you can measure it and know that it's
happening.
fact.
It's a very weird world. I mean, people can look up, quantum particles, and like I say, quantum mechanics is the science. It's called quantum mechanics, which is the study of the behavior of the quantum particles. And like I said to you, well, the thing about the quantum particles is the behavior is that they misbehave, and they do things that don't seem logical, that defy, that are counterintuitive. It doesn't seem like it could happen. It's a very weird world, and it's very interesting to look into. And these things are happening on this quantum level. So you look at this stick or something, you look at anything around you, it looks like it's just sitting there, but interior in the not the atomic, but the subatomic, the quantum level, all these weird things are going on that you can't even see and you can't even measure, but they're happening. And what we've been able to do, I say we, the world of science has been able to do, is to decode some of these things. For example, some of these little quantum particles. And once again, for the sticklers, I am specifically calling them particles instead of all the other names that you could call them, to be simple. But some of like a quantum particle, we know this, can actually be in two places at once. Now, I'm not saying that the quantum particle can go from place to place very quickly and look like it's in two places at once or appear to be in two places at once. It can actually exist in two places at the same time. In two places at the same time. And other things can happen. Like if this particle moves a little bit, this particle over here, and by over here, I mean, it could be across the universe. It will move simultaneous. If you were to move one, the other one will move. They're not connected. And even the speed of light can't travel that fast to go from one to the other. So it's not even a reaction of one and then the other. They defy the laws of physics as we understand them. It's like time travel, okay, but faster and better. And so in the fact that a single particle can be in two places at once, three places at once, 1,000 places, it doesn't matter. A single particle can exist. Now that's almost too much for us to comprehend, but it's true. So now we learn that. And they, like I say, they won a Nobel Prize to figure out that, well, wait a minute, some of these particles don't follow the second law of thermodynamics. Not only can they do weird stuff like that, but they not only do that, but some of them will actually go to a higher level of order instead of disordering. That we think everything's going to disorder over time. These go to a higher level of order, and they give off energy while doing this. So we go back. What if in this body, not one out of every 10,000 or one out of every million or one out of every 1,000, but more than one? All it takes is that one extra particle. What if more than one starts to reorder? Well, it could start sort of a chain reaction. And by chain reaction, I mean,
didn't you say that a boson can recruit other particles to behave like it behaves to order themselves rather than to disorder themselves? That's what fascinated me. I'm like, oh wow, there's something in this universe that has a positive influence on other things around it.
Yes.
And you guys can measure that in the lab, but that's a fascinating thing to contemplate. And the fact that if one particle or wave, or we'll call it particle, can be in more than one place simultaneously. Well, I know just enough to know that space and time are connected. In fact, they're inseparable, are they not? So a particle, and I don't want to get ahead of you, steal your thunder, so stop me
No, please.
If it can be in more than one place simultaneously, it can be, in fact, in more than one time.
Exactly.
Simultaneously. That's fact that scientists know through studying it in the laboratory. That's mind-blowing. That's hard for the layman to just wrap our minds around.
It's hard for anybody. It's hard for anybody to understand, because it's so counterintuitive
how that functions.
Right. And so these particles then they'll do things that like I say are counterintuitive. It's hard to figure how they're doing this, because it's not what we experience. And so the beginning of this process is it begins something that we call an exponential process. So one way to look at this is, we've heard this, people talk about, well, if you and I know a secret, and we know the secret today, and you can't tell anybody today, but tomorrow you can tell two people and I can tell two people. And the next day, each one of those can tell two people. So today there are two people who know it. Tomorrow there'll be what? 6 people that know it.
Right.
And then the next day there'll be, and so it just keeps doubling. And
you got a few dozen people by the end of the first week, but then
it's like it's not really big, not too many people know it still after a week or a couple of weeks. Between the 28th and the 32nd day, by the 32nd day, all 6-7 billion people on Earth know it. Okay, and the day after that, another whole Earth full of people could know it, because we'd have that much, it doubles. It's an exponential curve. So it redoubles itself. So when one is reordering, and then the next one starts to reorder, and then this happens over time, then it turns out, according to my calculations, and I have graphs, I have all this stuff, but it turns out that if this starts to happen in a human body, considering the dimensions of a body and all the measurements and the mass of the body, etc., then at about the 36-hour mark, all of the particles, all of these subatomic particles in this body are reordered, and what happens is they start to reorder. And here's the thing, Craig, once they start to reorder, now, why did they start to reorder? I don't know. Why did they start to reorder? I don't know. Because there's no jumper cables. There was no nothing that started it. There was all I know is that the only person even near this was a dead person. The only evidence I have, there was one person near and he was dead. And so, from the philosophical point of view, it had to be a matter of will. Whose will? Because this guy was dead. So, that's above my pay grade. I don't know why it started, but once it started, it wouldn't stop. This reordering would not stop.
I tried to make a contribution to this discussion with you a while back, and that my limited understanding of nuclear physics, speaking of fission, and how this replication, this exponential multiplication process reminded me of nuclear fission. And you said, yeah, that's actually not a bad analogy, only this is ordering things, not destroying and disordering. It's exactly.
This is much more elegant.
Far more elegant, entirely more elegant than
this is
fission.
creation. And so this is the reordering. And like I say, once this reordering started, if it started and how it started, ask somebody else. But if it started, well, it apparently did. And once it started, it wouldn't stop. And so it would continue to reorder. Now we are in what I call that order. Remember I said that lobby of that building, that lobby where everything is there? That's where we are. We are ordered, but we are in the place where time is a measurement of change towards disorder. So things, if here in the lobby, things always tend toward disorder. We know in the lobby, we're going to the basement eventually,
Yeah.
But in this case, I tell people, like in this particular case, this body, it didn't come up because, you see these images of resurrection and light going everywhere and the body, rising, or the person taking the cloth. No, that would mean he would just come back to life like this, and he would then still be subject to disordering again. But in this particular case, according to, and once again, we're not looking at the philosophy or the theology of it, I'm looking at the physics of it. Then what would happen is this body then would continue the subatomic particles, they would not stop reordering. They would continue to reorder, and these quantum particles would continue to reorder. And so I tell people, it's not like he came back to the lobby and got out and said, "Hey, I'm back. I'm alive. Did you miss me? I told you I'd be back." He didn't stop. He didn't come to the lobby. He went like on the express elevator all the way up. He went right past the lobby, because once again, I'm not talking about theologically. I'm talking about physically. The quantum particles would not have stopped at the order that we are. It would have continued on. Once they began, for whatever reason, they would not stop. And so they would continue to reorder, once again, incredibly overly simplified, but they would continue to reorder until they could reorder no more. There is a limit to how much they could reorder. They reorder to the point of what I call, and I coined this word years ago. You do see it actually in some books that talk about this, but the word I came up with was super order. It gets to a point where it can no longer order anymore. It is at a super order. It's not going to stop till it gets there. And once it gets on the way there, it's giving off tremendous amounts of energy, tremendous amounts of heat, tremendous amounts of light as a byproduct. And it gets to a point where, because of the electromagnetic forces, because of the spaces between the atoms, that this body then that's inside this cloth, that's inside here, the body becomes so ordered that it can't even hold up the weight of the cloth anymore. The cloth actually falls down through what's left of the body, the irradiation, the super ordered body. Yeah. It actually starts to fall down through it. And once again, the body doesn't rise up or anything. It's the body, the quantum particles of this body are exactly the same, but now they're in a they're the exact same particles, but now they're in a super ordered state. They're giving off all this heat and light. And now they get to a point where, and once again, all these things are happening in tandem with each other. So there's a lot going on. That's why we covered all the thing about time and space and atoms. All these things are coinciding now. And the cloth actually, it being an inanimate object, and just as sort of witnessing this whole thing, starts to actually just fall down through the spaces and through the magnetic forces and through the ultraviolet light and heat that's left over. I tell people this: energy did not cause the resurrection. The resurrection caused the energy. The energy, the light, all that was left over. As the cloth fell down through, we were able to do measurements of this and replicate this experimentally. The image was burned onto the cloth, and only on the top fibers. I'll just put it this way. I did write this down just so I remember how to phrase it. As the structure of each cell of the body reached perfection, the atoms and the molecules and the quantum particles that make them up, along with the associated electromagnetic forces, became aligned to such a degree that any object or force could pass through the spaces between them unobstructed. So the
no more physical resistance.
No more physical resistance. It would just fall. And as it falls, the light, the heat that's left over, burned an image onto the cloth. Now we could, we're able to test things like how much energy is output, and it didn't happen all at once. It would have exploded, but it did fluoresce. the light, the air molecules, and they glow. It's not like you shine a light through a dark room and you can see the beam. It's actually the air molecules are fluorescing. So the air itself starts to glow in colors that are probably unimaginable to us. It also produced that amount of release of energy, several hundred joules per square centimeter. It releases so much energy over a period of time. If it had gone too fast, it would have exploded and destroyed everything. If it had gone too slow, it wouldn't have created an image. But because it goes that, once again, probably took about 36 hours exponentially to go a long time where it seemed like nothing's happening. And then the last 18 or so minutes, it seems like everything is happening. But it actually started to produce a noise, a very high pitched noise. And then it got louder and deeper. The release of energy produces a noise. And then it got to where it actually probably sounded like an earthquake. It probably shook the ground, the resonant frequencies. So, and then there was light, the air was sparkling. And once that died down, once the superorder was complete, the cloth fell down through the body, the irradiating body, the perfect body now. And it's, once again, these atoms, these molecules, and these quantum particles are exactly the same. They are the same atoms, molecules, cells, et cetera, that were in the body, but now they're in the superordered state. So they're in this, they're able to do things. And once the body reaches the superorder, and so, so we're able to trace it all the way. Once it begins, we're able to trace what would happen, and even what would happen to the cloth, what would be left on the cloth. And we found out that there would be an image on the cloth, and the image would have some very interesting characteristics. For example, the image would be only on the top fibrils of the cloth, because as the cloth fell down through the body, as the cloth is falling down in the weave of a thick linen cloth, there's enough oxygen on outside the cloth, where the heat, the light, the ultraviolet light could react to that, and as it falls through, it reacts to it, and then there wouldn't be an image in the interior of the cloth because it's too bound up. There's not enough oxygen to cause the reaction, but it would only be on the top fibrils of the cloth, which we would view as the inside of the cloth. So as we open, then when we take the cloth that's folded like this, and then we open it up, then we'd see the image here. Right. So only on the top fibrils of the cloth is where the image would be. There would be no material would have been added to produce the image. It would be composed, the image would be composed of degraded cellulose. There'd be no image underneath the blood. The blood had gone on first. When the cloth was laid down, the blood is there, then the image is formed by this process, and then the physics of this event, and then the blood actually blocks the formation of the image. So if you flake off some blood, there's no image underneath it. It would be, interestingly enough, directionless, because there's no image of application, there's no direction of application, except up and down as cloth falls
through.
Not as the body goes up, but as the cloth falls, gravity pulls it down. Only image, direction is up and down, not sideways or anything like that. So the image would be directionless. Interestingly enough, it would also be invisible within 6 feet. It would be a photographic negative. The front of it, as it falls through, would be very focused. As the cloth falls through, be very focused on the front here. The body laying down on the back, nothing falls through the back, but it's touching the back. So that image would be blurry, just the same way it is on the shroud. It would cause the sides to bulge out, which shows us the front and the back of the man, not necessarily his sides. As the cloth is falling through the body, as you can see on my profile, if something's going this way, mapping this way through my body, it touches my nose first. See? So the nose is going to be in contact, and that's going to form an image a lot longer than my ear. It's going to be way down. It's not going to touch my ear till it gets way down here, but the nose all the way through. So what I'm showing by doing that is that it's mapping a 3D image.
Yeah.
It's just not mapping a frontal image or a back. It's actually mapping the 3 dimensions. How far
Falling
does this
through.
have to go? How far down through the body? So it gives these 3D, it gives these incredible 3D characteristics that you can't make any other way on an image. And all anatomical features would be perfectly recorded at that moment. At that
Right,
moment,
that
all
instant.
anatomical features
Yeah.
would be perfectly recorded. And so it turns out all of the characteristics are there.
Yeah.
All of them are there. So this had to be what happened.
Now, the time that it took for that linen to fall through that super ordered body was that was another contribution I was proud of to offer to you, that amount of time may have been what caused that 3D information to be in that 2D image. Because you were explaining to me early on, they knew that there was 3D information in there, but they couldn't recreate a 2D image that would give you a 3D pull out, if you will. If you could extract it with certain, and that was my thought as to if it took an amount of time, almost like a CT scan, falls through, and it has a different topography at a different instant as it falls through, and that may have been where the 3D information came from. And it's just mind-blowing. It's really cool that was all there, and that garment has lasted so long, and that it was left for us to just kind of
it's amazing
as a bonus kind of a thing. I think it's beautiful. But I don't want to interrupt you.
No, I mean that's perfectly the way you phrase that. It's just, it felt that it mapped those 3D characteristics on there, and here's the thing: you could take, and you can't get 3D characteristics off a photograph, because a photograph is a 2-dimensional, and it may have lights and darks and all that, but it may look like 3-dimensional, but it's not. And we have these little holograms that kind of look like things are moving a little bit, but we know that they're not. But even those don't have 3-dimensional characteristics on them; they just have reflectors and refractors or whatever. But this one not only has the 3-dimensional characteristics, even a photograph of the shroud. You could take a photograph of the shroud, and that photograph will have the 3-dimensional characteristics.
Oh, wow.
That photograph,
I didn't know that. That
really
defies
phenomenal.
all logic.
The photograph will have the 3-dimensional characteristics. But you could take a photograph of a statue and it'll have 2-dimensional characteristics. Take a photograph of Craig Sawyer, 2-dimensional characteristics. The photograph will. Take a photograph of the image on the shroud, it'll have 3-dimensional characteristics. It has everything is mapped on there. So it's really, really phenomenal of like you said, what we were left with. And it's just astounding, what we're able to decode out of that thing. And I didn't think any of it was possible when I first started, but it is.
Well, what an amazing set of discoveries, came out of just taking an honest look at something and exploring all of the factual evidence wherever it led. I mean, there are some things that I took away from it that really blessed me, if you will.
Right.
And one is that it makes sense to me. It sounds to me as though that's the type of body we will have. It's that super ordered body of Jesus Christ was not gone. It was still there at the instant when that linen fell through it, but it was super ordered. So that's a body that you explained it to me could walk through walls, because it wouldn't have that physical resistance as we traditionally understand it. So that type of super ordered body may be visible. It may not be visible to us. It may, it may be here, but it also may be over there simultaneously, as the bosons can do.
Right.
And an entire super ordered body with that characteristic can be in more than one place. If it can be in 2 places, it can be theoretically an infinite number of places and an infinite number of times.
Right. So
it could be here now or before or tomorrow. which
tomorrow, yesterday.
I mean, that's going to be hard for a lot of people to contemplate, but they
Now
can
it's
get online, they can research the behavior of the
of these
particles,
particles.
and it's known science, it's quantum mechanics. And so it's not, we're not
No, this is it.
we're
This
not
is
making
fact.
things up.
No,
You're
this is it. And this is where that
sharing
body went.
measured facts. So
There's
it's
your facts. And
fascinating.
this is where that body went. And it's interesting you put it that way, because in fact, you know, we're able to then make some assumptions about some very accurate assumptions about what this body's capable of, where, quote unquote, where it is, and what it's like now. And for example, you remember we said that time, remember the definition of time at the very beginning? What is time? It's a measurement of change, and change is always in the direction of disorder. One of the characteristics of the superorder, we can tell, we can map it right up to that point. One of the characteristics of, and the reason it kept going into the superorder is because in the superorder there is no more disorder. Things do not tend toward disorder once they get there. Here, you know, all the way there, they'll tend toward disorder. But once it goes past that certain point, there will be no tendency toward disorder. So no tendency toward disorder, and time is a measurement of change in the direction of disorder. So no tendency toward disorder means there's no time as we understand time. Okay. So now if there's no time as we understand time, you have to understand, go back to a little bit of, plotting of points. Point A is a point. Okay. Point B is a line. You have 2 points, you can make a line between them. Okay. To get from point A to point B takes time, because you're moving, you're changing from one thing to the other. That measurement of change to get from point A to point D takes time. If there's no time as we understand time, time being the measurement of change, if there's no time as we understand time, then there can be no space as we understand space. As we understand space. The quantum particles understand it differently. They misbehave. They understand it in a more accurate way. So if there's no, then this, where this body went, if you will, and I use the word went, you know, just because it's the only word we have, there is no time and there is no space. There's no tendency toward disorder, and there's no change toward disorder. So there's no time and there's no space as we understand them. So, I've heard
Yet
about
it is still physical.
It
is still physical.
As a matter of fact, it may be more real than anything you see around you. It's more ordered than anything you see around you.
I like the way you said it to me once. You said it's so natural, Craig. It's supernatural.
It's super. Yeah,
it's more than natural. It's absolutely. It's so natural. It's supernatural. And that, I was always thinking of supernatural as that which is almost magic, like inexplicable. But it's really, once you understand the physics of it, that's how God created our universe. That's how it functions. I mean, those are his laws.
That's why I say it's more real than anything around you, because it's not, there's unnatural, then there's natural, then there's supernatural. Supernatural is better than natural. That's not a bad thing. That's not, the unnatural is the weird stuff. It's like that's not gonna, you drop something and it flies up instead of down. Well, that's unnatural. That's not what we find in nature.
Right.
But this is more natural than natural. It's supernatural, and that's what we find. I just, as a sort of an aside, there's is it the CERN? Is it the in Switzerland?
CERN,
particle accelerator. And they find that every there are these particles, they find these Higgs bosons, et cetera, that will almost look like they're going out of existence, and they'll come back into existence, and they won't exist. Then they'll come back to existence, and they're thinking, well, how can that be? Well, I'm looking at this saying it's because they're fluctuating. They're in the interface between the ordered and the superorder. And when they go to the other side, if you, as my grandparents would call it, when they make that little transition in that interface over to that superorder, they go invisible. You can't detect them. And then you come back. What are some of the qualities of this body? Some of the characteristics of this body in the superorder, this body that was in this cloth that now left this roadmap for us to find, and this evidence for us to trace what happened. And this is, to me, good news, because to me, this says, as you know, and once again, I'm not a theologian, and this is my opinion, but this, it says, hey, if this resurrection happened, and I believe it did based on the physics, then if this was the historical Jesus of Nazareth, and it seems like it is, then he did not abandon us in the resurrection. In other words, he didn't say, I'm going to do a magic trick, I'm going to rise from the dead. You fend for yourself, you know, good luck. He said, this is natural. This is not only natural, it's supernatural, you know. So this is, you know, it's not an abandonment into a magic trick. It's this is what he was made of the exact same particles that we're made of. You know,
it's for us too. We will one day.
He took those into that super order all the way where with this, we can watch it. We can watch it all the way and trace it and map it out all the way up to that moment. And what is the characteristics? Well, this body, like you said, could be in not just one place at a time or two places at a time, can be in infinite places at a time, because it's not at somewhere where we understand time or space. And it's not that it could be at 2 or 3 places or 10 places or 1,000 places right now. It can be in 2 or 3 places or 1,000 places right now, 10 years ago, 100 years into the future, because it's not in time and space as we see it and we understand. It's another realm. It's another level of understanding. And can it go through a wall? Yeah, pretty easy. And can it become visible to a person, like in a vision? Yeah. Yes to all of those things. Can it heal? You hear people talking about healing, whether it's cancers or tumors, and very often we hear about heat. I've heard this from people who said they were healed of one malady or another, and they'll say, oh, there was tremendous heat, you know, in my back or in my, you know, wherever the healing took place. And very often for years I thought, well, maybe the heat must do the healing. And then because of this, I realized the heat's not doing the healing. The healing
is a byproduct. Heat's a byproduct of the healing, right?
The byproduct. It's just like
the body's ordering itself.
It's like a limited reordering, like a limited resurrection, limited reordering.
And that small ailment, whatever.
That's small, and let's correct that. But it's going to, because of this and because of the physics, it's going to give off energy. It's going to give off heat. It's going to give off light, maybe. But heat, we can feel we're very sensitive to heat. But anyway, so you put all that together and you have a resurrection.
Yeah, I mean, it gives a lot of understanding on a practical level, you know, if you can consider quantum mechanics, you know, practical for the layman, but you know, again, it's measured and it's fact. And I just think it's fantastic.
You also go back through the miracles in the, you know, in the Bible,
and understand better what was going on.
I can tell, you know, when Jesus was healing people, and like I say, I don't recall him ever doing anything bad. He didn't really hurt anybody. He healed them. He rose them from the dead. He did all this stuff. But in doing that, you can see wasn't a magic trick. He was using physics.
Yeah.
You know, he was able to harness that. And like I say, even through the resurrection itself, it was not just natural, but supernatural. And that's a good thing.
Well, without stealing your later talk's thunder on DNA, my last thought on it would be that if the DNA, because the DNA does contain all of the information of what it takes to recreate another one of us, right? Every cell, isn't it true scientifically, every cell has the complete DNA code in it. Yes. So for whatever I am, good, bad, or indifferent, if you got one of my cells, theoretically, you could recreate another Craig Sawyer. I may not want to because he breaks things, but the information's there. So, and there's all that information determines all kinds of things. How long you live, for example, at what point that body wears out, at what color of eyes and hair and on, right? All of it.
Right.
And so I just thought, man, wouldn't it be plausible that DNA and that body had that code pre-programmed in it to start that first bosun recruitment process?
Well,
at the moment of death, once that body expired, once it was no longer animated, in the traditional sense, that maybe that was what was was encoded into that body to trigger that first replication process, and there begin your 36 hours. It was just a thought
think
that
it
I
did.
had.
I think it did. Personally, I think that the mechanism that started the exponential process probably started at the moment of death, because otherwise something had to happen. Why not happen at that moment? And then it would actually makes, the timeline actually seems to fit that. But I will tell you this, and this is I hate to put it this way, but this is another thing that I can't get into a lot, but I will tell you this, that we may have a way to, by using the physics of this process that I'll call resurrection, we may have the ability upcoming to not raise somebody from the dead, because that's another whole thing with physics, but to use that in a limited capacity to understand that physics and to understand those quantum particles, et cetera, and to understand the manipulation of them and the control of them to heal diseases, maybe to heal viruses, maybe knock some viruses off the planet for good, to maybe heal all sorts of things. I personally, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but personally, I believe this. It's going to be possible to heal cancers of all sorts. I know a lot of pharmaceuticals don't want to hear that, but it may be possible to do it this way without pharmaceuticals, but just using physics, and with and also HIV, and Alzheimer's, and on and on and on. Because all of these things, all disease, I believe, pretty much all disease starts at the quantum level. That's where it starts, and we can go down there and address it at that level, as opposed to addressing, for example, cancers. I'm sure you know people who've had cancers, and the healing of it, the treatment is brutal.
Oh,
It's brutal.
it's in many cases, it
barbaric.
seems worse than the actual illness itself.
Yeah,
It's
I've known
just
people who've died
horrific.
from the treatment, and
Yeah.
we burn it, we poison it, we cut it, and no, because we're catching it way downstream. Let's do it upstream. Let's do something else. But there may be a whole new, you and I've talked about this a little bit, but there won't get into it here, but there are going to be incredible technologies come out of this understanding.
Well, wouldn't it be a beautiful thing if that's one of the things that comes out of this knowledge? But at any rate, it's a fascinating
Really
study, and just to share with the masses out there, because there's billions of people out there searching for the truth, and I celebrate it wherever it shows up. And man, I consider myself honored to call you friend, and I'm a fan of your work and your study, and I just wanted to be able to help shine a little light on your efforts and your discoveries, and try to help amplify that and help usher that out to the populace a little bit.
Thank you.
In my limited capacity, we'll see how actively some of the platforms try to stifle the evidence, which would be tragic, but it seems to be normal these days.
They can stifle the videos and things like that, but they can't stifle the physics.
Yeah,
because the truth is just the truth, and the facts are the facts, and it's gonna get out there. I mean, people are.
Well, look, it's like you said, it's good news. If you love somebody, you want them empowered. Knowledge is power. So this has been a genuine, honest discussion about facts, and so I do hope it resonates, and I hope it blesses people, and I hope it opens some eyes and brings clarification. So bless you, Jack,
thank you so much. I appreciate
what you've done, and for sharing it. And is there anything that I've failed to ask you about or allow you to say that you would want to share?
I would say 2 hours or more, 2.5 hours into this, I would say we've covered just about everything, everything that we can possibly cover in this format. But no, I think we've covered it. I think everything's out there.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you so much. And I look forward to getting this out there and watching people learn from it and celebrate it. So
Thank you,
we'll
sir.
chat with you again soon then.
Thank you. Thanks, Craig. Good
All
to
right,
see
sir.
you.
You too. Bye-bye.
Good night.